Muchas gracias, Joan, Mercè. Thank you very much. Good friends, Manuel, Nikki. Good to be here, and also eBay as partner of this collaboration represented by its director. So pleasure to be here. Thank you very much. I've been asked to set a bit the scene of what will be a session of a discussion on the state of transatlantic relations and NATO in particular. And that's what I'll do. And of course, we have to acknowledge first that the state of transatlantic relations is at a very low point in mutual trust. And I think that this is an important moment to think not only about capabilities and the tools that we have at our disposal when it comes to transatlantic security, but also to think about the alliance under a political framework. And I think that that's what I can do for the very initial stage of this discussion, hoping that the discussion afterwards will shed light on these ways to address the political aspects of the alliance. I would start by saying that probably the crisis that we are undergoing when it comes to this low point in trust relates more to the importance of values within the alliance rather than the capabilities that exist within the alliance. And actually what could have been a moment of great convergence, because we saw in The Hague this commitment to spend the famous 5% in capabilities, this could have led to this idea of great convergence of objectives among the allies in NATO, has now turned into something which I think is more important, which is the questioning of the same premises that are at the backbone of the alliance, including the validity of mutual defense, the shared recognition of threats, is it Greenland or is it Russia, and the idea that, of course, if we are equipped with this alliance, it's not for the reason to go through diverging paths, but rather to go through a united assessment of these threats. And the problem that we are facing now is that actually these paths have two very potentially disruptive ends if they succeed, if they materialize. On the one hand, we have tendencies to go solo within the alliance. In other words, that the alliance is not the place where consultation happens. Even at the worst times of transatlantic rifts, these have existed in the past. The fact that the alliance and NATO, but the broader political discussion between the US and the European Union was to be preserved, there was consultation. And I think that even in disagreement, consultation still needs to happen. And what we are seeing now these days is that there's no so much consultation or public or even private discussion on the main issues that affect us, the transatlantic community, when it comes to security, Iran, Venezuela, or even Ukraine as the main topics of our commitment. This is one path. The other possible path is that as a consequence of this rift, we're heading towards this idea that autonomy of Europe is done against this common understanding of transatlantic relations. We're seeing these sort of discussions when it comes to the nuclear umbrella in the European continent, protagonized by France, when it comes to Poland saying that perhaps it's time for having its own nuclear capabilities, and when it comes to Germany saying now it's time for national rearmament, only national rearmament. I think that all these phases of going solo are actually speaking of the difficulty to understand the alliance only on the basis of capabilities and not on the basis of politics and values, which is actually what is most important. So from The Hague to Ankara, the two milestones that we will be discussing today, I think that political discussion should take precedence over the idea that we discussed in The Hague on capabilities and defense expenditure, which remain important goals, but are not the only ones to be discussing. Because actually, let's not forget one thing, which is crucial to the history of NATO, to the history of the Transatlantic Alliance, which is that the sense of purpose of NATO is deterrence of others, is not healing disagreements among ourselves. This is when NATO and transatlantic relations are powerful, is when others believe that there's a united sense of agreement among the Europeans and the Americans, right? So if we have to start this process of healing these political wounds that we are suffering from, I think that a few points need to be made, and I'll be brief on this. First one, I think a lot depends on the perception of alliances that the current American administration has vis-à-vis NATO, but in general around the world. Alliances, if they are perceived as a burden, if they are perceived as costs only, necessarily go in line with the loss of common action, right? I think it's more important than speaking about spending targets, which we have agreed overall in The Hague. If we don't understand that alliances are made for the positive sum relations that are established among the members, then it will be very difficult to heal these political wounds that we are suffering from. Second, the commitment to 5%, if we're talking about capabilities and expenditure targets, has to be in exchange for the validity of Article 5. I think that if the NATO alliance is void of its core component, which is mutual defense, and it's only focused on who contributes what onto the alliance, I think we're missing the big picture. It's important that we remain faithful to the agreement on the purposes of the alliance. And of course, here, Greenland is a key issue that now is not on the front page of the newspapers, but that might come back at some point as a key issue for the alliance. Third, if we have a broader, and Manuel was mentioning this now, if we have a broader understanding of security, and we think about security including defense, but also going beyond defense, then alliances are the best way to tackle broad security concerns, right? Let me put a non-NATO related example, which is Israel these days. Of course, it has a say on a lot of what's happening in Iran now. But the long-term consequence of what is happening in Iran now might be that eventually Israel finds itself cornered to only one side of the American public and support and administration. And it loses support of another side of the administration, which has been traditionally very in line with the support for Israel in the region, and thus this alliance becomes only part of one party supporting Israel and the other turning against it when it comes to the consequences of Gaza war or when it comes to Iran. I think this is what we should avoid in the transatlantic relation. Transatlantic affairs, transatlantic community has or cannot be hostage to only one political understanding of these relations. Another point which is important and related to this is that the West, transatlantic affairs in general, is not about zero-sum relations. It's never been about this. It's always been about positive sum, and most importantly, about the shared values that are behind the positive sum. And I'm sorry to say that it cannot be a political objective these days to empower the forces, the political forces that will not understand politics as a positive sum game, right? If patriots are the force, the political force to be reinforced in the European Union politics, I think this won't help the shape of the alliance, because at the very end, and we've seen that with Greenland, we're seeing that with Iran these days, patriots might not align with the objectives of the United States. They might be saying this is not our war in Iran, or they might be saying it's a bit too much to go and want to invade or to take hold of Greenland as a European sovereign territory. I think it's important to understand that what has been at the core of the Transatlantic Alliance has been precisely this idea to work on the center of politics and not so much on the margins of politics. So I think that there's a lot to be done on the political side to make the case for the validity of transatlantic affairs. And I think that now it's a very necessary time for NATO to recover its original purpose, which is, I insist, deterrence against other threats and external threats, come them from where they come, and not so much healing or dealing with the problems of our internal relation within the Transatlantic Alliance. So a lot to be done, and I'm very much looking forward to hearing to the discussions. And this is only the first preliminary food for thought for what has to follow now. Thank you very much.
Molt bona tarda, tothom. Good afternoon, everyone. It is a pleasure to moderate this panel today on a very timely question, the future of NATO. Wow, that's a very important topic, right? I think most of us here belong to a generation, at least in Spain, for whom NATO was not a central issue, right? If we think about the Spanish referendum in 1982, since then, the topic NATO was something limited to policymakers, probably military circles or politicians, but not to the general audience. That has clearly changed. Look at the room. It's full. So we are interested in NATO, and if we look back, NATO was founded the goal of NATO when it was founded, it was said by, at that time, the General Secretary, the goal of NATO is to keep the Americans in, the Soviets out, and the Germans down. Probably scholars love that simple sentence because it captures the logic of the NATO during the Cold War. But today, that logic might not be valid anymore. Right? So I was asking myself whether we are not really moving to another situation where the Germans are fully in, we are firmly against the Russians, and that it's the real uncertainty now, is whether the US will keep in to NATO. So this is not just a change of warplay. We are witnessing a period of radical changes, very radical changes. First, a revisionist Russia, whose war in Ukraine has fundamentally changed European defense. Second, a growing uncertainty about the long-term path of the US engagement in European defense. Maybe we won't see a withdrawal from the US, but we might see a reconsideration of its commitments, and that's something very serious. And third, we see an alliance that is growing, spending more. I just saw on the news that Spain officially spent 2% right now, today. And what's very important, we are Europeans, North Americans, trying to identify which military capabilities we need. Conventional, nuclear, more technology. So in our first panel, we gathered today to discuss about a very basic question. Will NATO survive? We probably think yes, but if the answer is yes, what will it look like? That's a very important question. So to help us unpack these questions, we are joined today by an excellent panel of experts. First, we have Oana Lungescu. She is Distinguished Fellow at RUSI and former NATO spokesperson. And I think she will bring a unique insider and Romanian perspective on the alliance. Mulțumesc, Oana. Next, Paul van Hooft. He is a researcher, leader for defense and security at the RAND Europe, and his work focuses on transatlantic security, European defense, and also the future of NATO, I guess so. So thank you so much, Paul, bedankt. And finally, Jonathan Sherry, historian and editor at senior editor at Eagle Intelligence Report. He will, I think, offer a historical perspective on security and strategic affairs. Each speaker will have 8, not 10, 8 minutes to share their thoughts. Then we'll come back with a few questions to get the discussion going. Okay. So I ask Oana to be, Jonathan to be the first speaker. Thank you.
Thank you. 8 minutes is a little bit short for a historian, but we'll get right into it. As a historian, I tend to think of things in terms of the past, of course, but also periods of the past, periodization, right? Temporal guidelines. So the question I want to pose today is simple. Have we entered a new period? Have we entered a new historical era, as the panel reads? It seems clear that the last few decades have seen a major structural shift. So today I want to outline briefly the contours of that shift, where we came from, where it seems we are, and where we might be going. We'll start in 1990 with the collapse of European communism. The post-Cold War order, established in the wake, is defined by a few key characteristics. First, unipolarity, and that takes place under the system-defining dominance of the United States. Within that, managed globalization takes place, emerges, an integration that's widely seen as beneficial and low risk to the West, this globalization. This is reflected in large-scale capital investment and offshoring into East Asia, in particular China. And the post-Cold War order is also characterized by limited conflict or bounded conflict. So wars are episodic or contained, not disruptive of the entire system. So Yugoslavia comes to mind, or Iraq. Today we're moving towards, it seems, a multipolarity, with a diffusion of power across actors, with a rising China that seeks parity with the United States, and a re-emergent and aggressive Russian Federation. The transition that we're seeing is from a stable, asymmetrical power structure to an unbalanced and fragmented structure. Today, globalization has become a vulnerability in which interdependence now creates strategic exposure for the West. Moreover, conflict is no longer bounded, it's more constant. It operates across various domains like cyber warfare, economic, maritime, informational. So if we compress this, the post-Cold War system relied on concentrated Western power, contained conflict, and managed globalization. The system that seems to be emerging today is one of fragmented power and persistent instability and increasingly weaponized interdependence, economically speaking. So where does this leave the Transatlantic Alliance in the United States? Today, the US remains militarily dominant, but it's stretched and subject to supply chain and industrial vulnerabilities, and of course, polarizing political cycles and internal tensions within the alliance. It's less able to impose system-wide outcomes as it once did. NATO was built for deterrence within a stable system. The Cold War settlement, right, after the war, contradictorily it functions as a stable system. Yet in the last few decades, it has transitioned from an alliance that manages outcomes to one that must manage continuous instability and competition. So this is the general context in which US foreign policy operates. And the issue I'd like to highlight here is that I think there's growing evidence that US foreign policy still operates on assumptions formed in that original post-Cold War period, even as the conditions that sustained that dominance today seem to be eroding. Those assumptions include that alliance cohesion will be reliable, that US military dominance and escalation control is uncontested, that dollar dominance can be imposed as a financial coercion or a form of financial coercion without blowback, and also that the United States still has overwhelming economic and material power through secure supply chains and the continued attractiveness of the US market. These conditions have not disappeared, but their reliability has degraded. Alliance cohesion is more fragile and politically contingent, which we're going to talk about today. US power is increasingly contested, especially from the emerging near-peer power, China. Sanctions and other forms of integrated deterrence increasingly deliver diminishing returns, and now we have seen that they have triggered second-order consequences, like the solidification of adversarial alliances or the driving of currency reserve diversification away from the dollar. Finally, interdependence has become a source of vulnerability, leveraged by adversaries. So US strategy seems to remain calibrated to a system in which these advantages were largely uncontested. But today it operates in one in which they persist to some degree, but they're increasingly constrained and contested. The clearest manifestation of this shift, in my view, is China. The post-Cold War order assumed that economic integration with China was strategically safe because political reform in China would follow economic reform. That didn't happen, as we know. Instead, we see an economically integrated China whose political system is only more entrenched than it was before, who has dominated certain strategic industries through large-scale state-driven investment, and whose rapid military buildup is characterized by centralization and advanced military technologies. At the same time, China has increased its economic and financial reach through using its state-owned enterprises in lending and infrastructure development. Diplomatically, this has led US allies to compartmentalize their cooperation, meaning continuing security collaboration with the United States, even while expanding economic engagement with China, as we've seen recently. In this environment, China's political economy becomes particularly relevant. Its alignment of state, party, industry, and long-term strategic planning. This does not mean that China operates without constraints or without significant internal problems, but it does mean that it operates with a different set of advantages in a system defined by strategic competition and economic interdependence, which is often leveraged to political end. Yet, this is not cause for pessimism. The Transatlantic Alliance has faced a systemic competitor before in the Soviet Union. The parallel is useful, but the situation today is quite more complex and different. The Soviet Union was a military ideological rival but it was, generally speaking, economically separate and hermetic from the global system. Today, the systemic competitor is embedded within the very structure in which the Western alliance operates. So what does that mean for the Transatlantic Alliance? NATO was designed in a binary Cold War system in the aftermath of the Second World War, and with a clearly defined adversary. It now operates in an increasingly multipolar environment, characterized by overlapping relations and diffuse forms of competition. In short, NATO was built for a world of separation, but it now operates within a world of entanglement. The nature of the problem that the alliance was built to solve has changed. And I would say that as a result, the alliance itself must adapt, not just in what it does, but in how it understands the world in which it operates. And I can talk more about these things in the question and answer if any of you have questions, but I think I've probably reached my time. So thank you.
Bona tarda. Estic molt contenta de tornar a Barcelona i especialment en aquest extraordinari edifici de Gaudí, en el garatge. So I'll continue in English. I won't torture you anymore. Now, obviously, we've heard a lot about uncertainty. There's a lot of bad news and a very dangerous world out there. Let me just start with some of the good news. I spent some of the afternoon listening to a press conference by the NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte so that you don't have to. As Luc mentioned, he was actually launching the annual report of NATO, and some of the headlines are that allies are stepping up. In 2025, NATO's European allies and Canada have increased defense spending by 20% compared to 2024. And interestingly, there are 3 countries already investing well over 3.5%. That's Poland, Lithuania, and Latvia, followed in order by Estonia, Denmark, Norway, and the US. NATO's also launched 3 new missions in the last year in response to various sets of challenges. Baltic Sentry after the attacks on critical undersea infrastructure in the Baltic, then Eastern Sentry after the Russian interference in Allied airspace in Poland and Estonia and Romania, and now Arctic Sentry, dealing with the whole High North as well as Greenland, of course. And it's also, in the last month or so, decided to adapt its military command so that it becomes more European, which I think is an important trend for the coming years. Let me also mention that when you talk about defense spending, Spain indeed is estimated this year to reach 2%. Together with a couple of other countries such as Belgium and Italy. At the same time, NATO's been working very closely with the European Union, as we've heard, and with the Indo-Pacific partners, including to ramp up innovation and industrial production, and also working very closely with Ukraine when it comes to innovation, these rapid cycles of innovation, sometimes as short as 3 weeks when it comes to drone production and modernization on the front line in Ukraine, but also to provide long-term support to Ukraine. So, on paper at least, NATO is well prepared for the Ankara summit in July. However, as we all know, the reality is much more complex and it's much darker in many ways, much more unpredictable. President Trump posted recently that NATO allies are cowards. Today he's posted again saying that NATO nations have done absolutely nothing to help with Iran. We've also seen reports today in the Washington Post that the Pentagon is considering diverting much needed military aid from Ukraine to the Middle East. That's not been confirmed, and Secretary General Rutte today made clear that support to Ukraine continues to flow. However, it's quite clear that the Transatlantic Alliance is at a turning point, perhaps unique in its history, with an unpredictable United States, a very dangerous Russia, which remains the biggest danger to Europe, a challenging China, and a Europe that, although getting stronger, remains in many ways vulnerable. And I think it's important to look at China also in connection to Russia, Iran, and North Korea, because while China is embarked on a massive military buildup, including with nuclear weapons in an opaque, really untransparent way, China has also been enabling Russia, together with Iran and North Korea, to continue its war on the European continent. And faced with these challenges, as we've heard, Europeans have only started to seriously invest in their own defense over the last decade. To the question that Lluc asked, will NATO survive? I think we have no guarantees that NATO will survive. And I say that obviously with great concern as a strong Atlanticist, but I would argue that it's in our interest that it should survive and that it should continue to adapt as it's done throughout its decade-long history. It's not the first time, and I think it's important to put this into historical context, as Jonathan did. It's not the first time that we have disagreements within NATO, and perhaps not many in this room will remember the Suez Crisis, but it was a very important and dangerous crisis in the history of NATO. I think many may remember the Iraq War and the serious divisions that we had during that time. And every time, allies have been able to overcome the differences, to focus on what unites them, which is their common interest to defend and protect each other, even in times when we may not always share values or the values that we consider fundamental, we still share that fundamental interest. But I think we also need to realize that this is a time in particular when both our allies and our adversaries only respect one thing, and that is strength. So I would argue that for NATO to survive and for Europe to remain protected and safe for the future, Europeans must become stronger, not to please President Trump. And I think that's an important point, but to defend their own continent, to keep their own countries, their own nations, our own way of life, and to remain safe and peaceful as we would want to be. At the same time, I would also argue that we need to do whatever we can to keep the United States committed to European security. Because the reality is that, at least for the next decade, we will find it hard to defend Europe without the United States, and indeed without countries that are outside the European Union, the UK, Norway, and yes, Turkey. And if we don't, we will certainly need to spend much more than 5%, controversial though that is. So the talk in NATO now, as we look to the Ankara summit in July, is not of burden sharing, as we've heard for many, many years before. It's of burden shifting. The aim is that Europeans should be able to take primary responsibility for the conventional defense of the continent, while the US promises to continue contributing key but more limited capabilities, and also to maintain the extended nuclear deterrence, which I think is an important point. So the point made by many in the administration is that they would want partnership, not dependency. And I think that's a message that we can all understand and generally agree on. However, that messaging from the administration remains extremely confusing, sometimes contradictory, and it's unclear what the timetable of that burden shifting is. The latest that we've heard is from the Supreme Allied Commander Europe, General Grinkiewicz, who of course is an American general, who told the US Congress that Europeans should be strong enough to lead the defense of their continent by 2035, which of course also happens to be the deadline for meeting the 5% of GDP objective. We also need to make sure that as we make that shift, there are no surprises and no gaps in our deterrence and defense. And that's where NATO is now trying to work out how to plan that, which is not easy. Because there is, I think, a consensus among the vast majority of our military and intelligence leaders that Russia will be in a position to reconstitute its forces and to try to attack NATO itself by the end of the decade. And so I think that's something that should be concentrating our minds. I think we also need to focus a bit more, perhaps, on the disparity, the division, not just between the US and Europe and Canada, that is real, but also sometimes between the north and the south of the continent, the northeast and the southwest, if you will, because we see that both in terms of investing in defense, but also currently in support for Ukraine. In the, for instance, the PEARL, the Prioritize Ukraine list of requirements, which is the scheme to allow NATO allies to acquire US capabilities for Ukraine, where predominantly it's countries from the northeast of the continent that are contributing. So I think the Ankara summit in July will showcase that Europeans and Canadians are becoming much more capable allies in terms of how much they invest, but also in terms of real capabilities. It's not just about cash. It's about what do we do with that cash. And the cash is not just there, the capabilities are not just there to show that, yeah, we've got fancy kit. It's about implementing the NATO defense plans, which are the most detailed defense plans that NATO has had since the end of the Cold War. So it's how to make sure that we have the forces, the capabilities, the exercise to readiness to ensure that should we need to take those plans off the shelf and implement them, we would have what we need to do that and to keep our people safe. So this is not just a figure pulled out of thin air. The reality is, talking to diplomats back in Brussels, you ask them about, okay, so what's going to be the agenda of the Ankara summit? Clearly, defense spending will be there, defense industrial production will be there, but people don't know. There's a lot of uncertainty, and we could even expect that the stabilization of the Middle East could be on the agenda. Turkey, as you know, has been playing a key role as a power broker, as a negotiator, is involved in the latest diplomatic effort in the Middle East. So I think we just need to watch that space because there's a lot of uncertainty even about the agenda. So how the wars in the Middle East and in Ukraine end, of course, will define to a large extent where NATO goes next, where we all go next. But ultimately, I would say, whatever happens, whatever the future holds, Europeans have agency. It is in our hands what we do and whether we become stronger or not. And I would say there's a no-regret strategy. If NATO somehow is no longer there and the US decides to walk away, then Europeans will be stronger. If we become stronger, we will also be a stronger partner, and a partner that can speak from a position of strength, not just to adversaries, but also to allies. So I would say it is up to us. Thank you.
Thank you. I think in these panels, it's always hard to follow on other speakers, especially if they make many of the points you would probably also want to make. But since my focus in my work is generally on deterrence, and in deterrence it matters most if you go last, I'll just do that. Okay, so my remarks will also center about, will NATO survive? And then the punchline will be, yes, but maybe, Jim, not as you know it. So also here to go back to history is to go and understand that NATO, as it has existed in the last 30, 35 years, was a very different kind of alliance than what it was set up to be. Because at its core, NATO is very much a nuclear alliance, where the US provides extended nuclear deterrence to its allies to protect them during the Cold War, to protect them against the Soviet Union, and thereby the US took tremendous risks. It did, as the keynote speaker just said, wasn't just for sort of altruistic reasons, right? That was to keep the Soviets out, the Americans in, and the Germans down. Why was that so important for the US? Because at that point in time, Western Europe was essentially the biggest biggest area of geopolitical significance outside of the continental United States. And if the Soviet Union or communist movements had gained control over it, it would have been tremendously dangerous for the US in the long run. Why take those enormous risks with extended nuclear deterrence, right? Because extended nuclear deterrence essentially says, I make a promise that if you hurt my friends, I'm willing to die for them. That is a very difficult to believe promise, right? So the reason that France has an autonomous nuclear weapon is because de Gaulle went to Kennedy and said, all due respect, am I supposed to believe that you'll sacrifice New York for Paris? That is a bit of a sort of simplistic way of putting it, but at the core, that is what it's about. So the US had a lot at stake in Europe. Still, to make it believable that it would do these things, it had to do a lot more. It placed conventional forces in Europe so that if things would go wrong, hundreds of thousands of American soldiers and Marines would die pretty quickly, and therefore make it a lot more believable that the US would, go to do something that involved nuclear weapons. So it's that, because Europe was important to maintain that influence, and also part of that is to really prevent the Europeans from gaining too many nuclear weapons, or too many European states gaining nuclear weapons. Not just in Europe, also in Asia, right? We could have easily lived in a world right now, or maybe the world wouldn't exist anymore. We could have easily lived in a world where you would have a German nuclear weapon, an Italian nuclear weapon, a Japanese nuclear weapon, a Korean nuclear weapon, a Taiwanese, an Australian, a Swiss, and so on, right? These were all states that considered it, but either by formal or informal security assurances were dissuaded from pursuing those nuclear weapons. Okay, that's a bit of history, but that gets us to the present. So it's of course very easy to focus on this particular administration. It's then also very tempting to say, well, the US and Europe still have a lot of shared interests and shared values, and that's all true, but there's also something substantially shifting. Because even though Europe, whether you see it as the EU plus the UK, key investment partner to the US, the most important one still, but key trade partner, all of these things don't really matter sort of to the American mindset as it has emerged in the last 20 years, where it's mostly seen as quite costly to provide European security. This is something that's preceded Trump by quite a bit, and that the real game is in the Indo-Pacific. Right? So already during the Obama administration, there was the Indo-Pacific pivot and sort of stopped. Even actually before Obama, the Bush administration in the 8 months or so before 9/11 was planning to focus primarily on Asia. So if nothing else, American presidents seem to get distracted quite often. which brings us to the present, right? Because after very clearly a few months ago stating in the National Defense Strategy and the National Security Strategy that Western Hemisphere and the Indo-Pacific were the priorities, Europe was a far third, and the Middle East was absolutely something that the US shouldn't do, we find ourselves in the current situation. That being said, there's still something beyond this administration, still something structurally happening. My data point is always that 4 years ago, during the Biden administration, sort of the most transatlantic president in decades, that the National Defense Strategy that was published 4 weeks after Russia's invasion of Ukraine, largest land war in Europe since the end of World War II. What did the National Defense Strategy say of the Biden administration? Russia is a great regional threat. However, the pacing challenge for the American for American Department of Defense is China. It's because China is the only state that can really present a challenge to US influence around the world. And that gets us again to the present. So if the focus is on China, if the focus is on the Chinese economic growth, military growth, the nuclear buildup, where there have already, again, preceding this administration, there have already been serious doubts whether the US has a large or sufficient nuclear arsenal to deter both Russia, China, and as a lesser case, North Korea. There's real doubts about that extended nuclear deterrence commitment. So there's something very odd in the National Defense Strategy saying conventional deterrence will be shifted, the burden for conventional deterrence in Europe and conventional defense in Europe will be shifted to the Europeans, but extended nuclear deterrence still works. If it's a very hard promise to make, it's even harder when you explicitly say that Europe is no longer a priority, and you're taking US soldiers and Marines, seem to be taking them away from where they might get hurt, which also suggests, that you're signaling that you don't really care sufficiently about it, at least as we've understood extended nuclear deterrence until now. So all of that together, leaves Europe, however you define it, EU plus UK, whatever, leaves us in quite a tricky position, which means that Europe, as it is doing now, but will have to do a lot more, but also will have to do a lot more than just spending, will have to think more independently, or that word which can trigger some parts of some rooms, more autonomously about its own strategy, right? Now, some of that is happening, so it's not that we're just throwing money at problems and hope that they go away. There are investments in conventional deep precision strike and integrated air missile defense, which all make it much more likely that you could both absorb Russian conventional aggression and respond to it, but that still leaves massive gaps. So in that sense, Emmanuel Macron's speech a few weeks ago is actually welcome news. It doesn't suggest that France is replacing the US, so that's doesn't suggest that it could replace the US as it is doing right now. It doesn't suggest that France is really going to provide extended nuclear deterrence, although I think it's a very French solution to talk about forward deterrence, which are you mean extending it forward? Okay, don't say extended, fine. So there's something happening there, and these are not bad signs. I also don't see that these things are going to drive the alliance apart, or at least not drive them apart more than the structural shifts that are already taking place. And that does mean that you might hopefully end up at a position that if the US cannot or will not defend Europe, that there's something solid and robust in place to take care of European security, and that if the US realizes that it's Europe is still a better set of allies to have than most other potential allies, and it rediscovers the value of alliances, then it has a more stronger alliance, and so do we. That said, you want to go back to the beginning of it. Will NATO survive? Yes, but then not as it is right now. So either it gets, if these trends, these defense spending trends don't persist, if this the more independent way of thinking about this doesn't build, and the European part of the alliance limps after the US leadership, such as it is, then it doesn't survive. If, on the other hand, Europeans do take care of these things, it will survive, but it will become an entirely different kind of NATO. It will become a more Europe-centric NATO. And that might not be something that this US administration or future US administrations particularly enjoy, because in the end, while the focus right now is on the costs of the alliance, I think what has been forgotten is that the immense amount of influence that having the alliance got the US. Because it's much nicer to have not the most powerful, but the second most powerful states on the planet enthusiastically most of the time following your leadership. So yes, that gets us to, will NATO survive? Probably, but it won't be the same kind of NATO, and maybe the US won't actually like it if the Europeans really do take care of themselves. All right, thank you.
All right, okay. So thank you very much for your wonderful presentations. Now, as the most interesting part is the questions from the audience, I just have one very basic question. So you definitely answered to my question, but it seems to me there is a paradox between the narrative saying, you know, the risk of the US abandoning NATO is very high, at least, and then reality. And reality is probably that the US presence in Europe has increased. Maybe, if I'm correct, if you think I'm not correct, please correct me. Then Europeans are spending like never before. Then the NATO has still plans to expand. They have the so-called global partners with Japan, for instance, Australia. So if you think that's a paradox, how do you interpret it?
Okay.
Who is first?
I think, yes, there is that narrative, and obviously we've seen signals, in particular from President Trump during his first administration, perhaps more during his second administration, of leaving NATO. Certainly, I was there at the NATO summit in Brussels in 2018, where he did threaten to walk out of the summit, and those were very tense moments, unless allies committed to investing much more, much faster in defense. So I think there is that. However, I think President Trump knows that there is a very strong support for NATO in Congress. There is strong support for NATO among the American public, even though, of course, we've seen trends in the opinion polls over the last few years that increasingly it's Democrats that support NATO, and there's decreasing support amongst at least certain parts of the Republicans, because, of course, the public also follows the message from the leadership. But there is strong support in Congress. There is strong support among the public, which also has led, for instance, to the Appropriations Act in the US Congress, which makes clear that the administration cannot have less than 76,000 US troops in Europe without notifying Congress and giving a strong reason why. For a longer period of time, there was also, the Congress also reinstituted funding for Ukraine, funding for the Baltics, which the administration had suspended. So I think you see this tug of war in the administration, and as I said, these sort of conflicting messaging. But I think President Trump, until now has stopped short of making good on his threats against NATO, because he realizes that that's not something that would get him a lot of votes, if at all, just the opposite in the US. But I think the reality right now is that there are around 80,000 US troops in Europe, still playing an important role. And we've seen, for instance, the fact that at least 3 ballistic missiles from Iran were intercepted by NATO's ballistic missile system, which includes, among others, the ships here in Rota, in Spain, but also, of course, the Patriot system that Spain has deployed in Turkey, and sites in Romania, Poland, Germany. So I think there is this collective endeavor that the US is and remains part of, and this is the beauty of the alliance, that we're all working together. And I think, if anything, when we talk about the narrative, it's important to make the case about why we need each other in this very dangerous world where threats transcend border, not just for Europe, but also for America. So if you have friends in Congress or American friends, remind them of why it's important also for America to be part of a club and a family where the US has more friends and allies than any other superpower.
Sure. If we're trying to resolve the paradox between what Trump says is happening and what is actually happening, the paradox between narrative and reality, I think that we have to take into consideration his general approach to problem solving, which in various areas, not just foreign policy, he engages in theatrics and overstatement and disorienting language to kind of throw off his opponent, in this case, not an opponent, a NATO ally, friend, but in order to improve his negotiating position at the table. So it is possible that we will see, I mean, today we see in social media an escalation of Trump's rhetoric about NATO, the NATO alliance, and we probably will see more of that. But whether it translates into an actual concrete, withdrawal of U.S. troops, for example, from Central Europe it's much harder to say. And I think it's far more unlikely. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So I think there's just an inherent obvious tension between what the U.S. administration is asking and what it might lead to. So I think we would be wrong if we think that this is just about the burden sharing to shifting kind of debate. This is not just about, dot whatever percentage of GDP, and if you just meet this, then everything is fine. I already signaled it quickly, I think, but if European defense spending, we're now talking about very serious amounts of money, right? Especially that now the German defense spending has increased so rapidly, that, given the size of the German economy, translates into immense amount of capital. If that capital ends up in more and more in European defense industrial players, companies, and doesn't flow to the US, and given some of the other rhetoric that has been flowing and sort of the doubts about how useful the weapons are if you don't support the US, I think if that's, cutting the costs of European security, but also at the cost of US influence and US earnings from defense industry, will create a real tension. And you can already see it, right? The pressure has been not just with this administration, but for the last 2 decades, it's like, yes, do more, but no, don't stop buying this, right? Don't do autonomy do autonomy in the other way, but not in defense industrial autonomy. And then in terms of the rhetoric, there's, I think, only so far that you can go, because the tension is also here, right? It's the message is not just about cutting costs, it's also about that Europeans, NATO, right, treats NATO essentially as if that's already, US is not part of it, but that is essentially a tool for US influence, right? The rhetoric in the last few weeks surrounding the Iran war is about the Europeans not sending their troops as tools or their ships as tools of what is essentially US action, and that's disloyalty by itself, and that undermines NATO, which is not what this is supposed to be about, right? And then there's maybe something else that, from all the sort of rhetoric and narrative and all these other things, well, maybe one point on that is that it's one thing to kind of say that the alliance still works, but if you keep saying things that undermine it, at some point people don't feel it anymore, and then it might not work anyway. But there's another part of it, which is sort of a harder capability part of it. And when I referenced the Biden administration, when I referenced the first Trump, or if I would reference the first Trump administration, there have been longer-term doubts if the US has the capability to protect Europe, the Middle East, and Asia at the same time. And there's been a longer-term push to really prioritize the Indo-Pacific, because that's where the greater challenge is, right? China is vastly more powerful than Russia is, and that's why even after the invasion of Ukraine, the Biden administration's national defense strategy said China is the priority. These doubts are real, and because those constraints are real. And for instance, in the last few weeks, just the amount of air defense and missile defense interceptors, precision weapons that have been fired off within just a few weeks have substantially constrained the ability of the US right now to protect Europe if things would escalate here, to protect its allies in the Indo-Pacific if things escalate there. Right? We have to get out of a mindset that, which was easy after the end of the Cold War, that this is just about values. Right? We also have to get out of a mindset that the US is all powerful. The US has not been as powerful as it was in the 90s for a long time, and that's partly by virtue of the fact that China was rising. Not necessarily that the US was ruining itself, but that China was rising. Now, if the US expends so much of its material left and right, well, there is not as much left to then protect us. So all these other trends that I already talked about then get accelerated, that we have to do it ourselves.
Thank you so much. Now it's time for the audience. So we have microphones around the room, right? I ask you to do three things. First, raise your hands, then identify yourself, and then make a quick, not quick, but not so long question. Let's call it like that. Okay, please.
One question.
Question, not a comment.
Okay, hello. Yeah, so I have a question for everyone, but it's mostly following Dr. Sherry's point about the fact that NATO was born in a bipolar world, and today maybe it's not functioning in a multipolar, maybe even apolar world. So do you think that today NATO in its form and how it is working could also represent a threat for international stability as it is of today?
I'm sorry, I don't understand the question completely.
Okay.
If NATO itself can...
If in its form of today, with this idea of a club, as Mr. Lungescu said, a club that is kind of directed by the United States, isn't it also seen as a threat by the Russian Federation, by China, triggering maybe the invasion of Ukraine and etc.?
I mean, sure, this is the narrative that the Russians put out, is that eastward expansion in NATO is the driving cause for the operation, the invasion of Ukraine. Certainly, it's seen that way by the Russians. Whether NATO becomes a separate pole in a multipolar world in a potential scenario where the United States withdraws from it is something that it belongs in the realm of game theory still at this point, but maybe you guys want to say more about that.
I mean, technically NATO is not supposed to do those things, right? But, you know, without seeing that as any kind of a legitimate point or justifying it, in the eyes of the Kremlin and Beijing, it is easy to understand that if NATO member states, whether it's a NATO mission or not, follow the US into certain military actions, that the alliance as a whole seems to take on a different role than what it is meant for, right? We can't, to make that more concrete, or to try to make that more concrete, we can't really do the counterfactual, but if NATO enlargement had happened, but the US and its allies had not operated, outside of maybe the first Gulf War, had not operated in the Middle East or in Afghanistan, probably the perception of NATO would be very different in Russia and in China. I can't prove it, but it seems the way, you know, whether you find them reprehensible or not, and I find them reprehensible, that is not, even if they'd had similar ideologies, they would still have that kind of interpretation of what was happening. What was happening, what the US and its allies could do in the 90s and 2000s for causes that were sometimes commendable, sometimes maybe less than commendable, was still very frightening to everybody else, right? And therefore, they probably responded to it. Seems reasonable to me.
Okay, let me say, as somebody who grew up in communist Romania, Romania at the time was part of the Warsaw Pact, led by the Soviet Union, with all the countries, the former communist countries, that were basically forced to join the Warsaw Pact because the Red Army was on our territory. The Red Army left Romania in 1958, the year I was born. So it's a very different club that Moscow was running than a club of democracies that actually decide that they want to democratically join an alliance. And do that sometimes with referendums, at all times with a lot of difficult, painful reforms. Again, we know the story of the countries of Central and Eastern Europe. It was not easy because, you know, the US, for one, wasn't so sure that they wanted to enlarge NATO, let alone the countries of Western Europe, which were certainly not convinced. There was a lot of discussion about the enlargement of NATO. But ultimately, those issues are not for Washington or for Moscow. They are the decision of each and every sovereign country. And that is enshrined in the OSCE Charter, in the Helsinki Final Act, in the Charter of Paris, in all the fundamental treaties that underpin European security, and that Russia itself has signed up to, including in the NATO-Russia Founding Act. It is the right of each country to freely choose whether it wants or doesn't want to be part of an alliance. So nobody else can tell us, you know, me as somebody born in Romania or somebody born in Finland, that, oh no, Moscow doesn't like this. You know, you would not like that, to be a small country in Europe and let your big neighbor, it's like, you know, France was telling Spain, oh no, no, you can't do that because we don't like it. I'm sorry. This is about what we, as sovereign independent people, decide to do democratically. So I think there's a big difference between the sort of military club that Russia used to run, which, by the way, tended to invade its own, like Hungary and Czechoslovakia, and the sort of democratic club, yeah, it's messy, totally, like NATO. It's not always pretty, maybe dysfunctional, like lots of families, but it's something where everybody has a voice and a seat and a say. And where the US doesn't, you know, I've been in all those North Atlantic Council meetings, the US doesn't always get its way. In terms of Russia, I think it's also interesting to note, and again, I was there, I became the spokesperson for NATO in 2010 at the Lisbon summit, where one of my big issues was to negotiate with the Russian delegation. President Medvedev, who was then president of Russia, was invited there because we had a meeting of the NATO-Russia Council. So I had to tell the Russian diplomats, well, President Medvedev cannot brief the media before the Secretary General of NATO and President Obama, because that's how NATO works and you're not an ally. But NATO worked really hard after the demise of the Soviet Union to establish a strategic partnership with Russia. That was in NATO's strategic concept adopted in 2010. That was one of the main points, building a strategic partnership with Russia. And I can also tell you that in 2014, at the beginning of the year, we were working very hard with the Russian colleagues to establish the first joint mission of the NATO-Russia Council, which would have been a naval escort of a US vessel, the USS Cape Ray, which was going to destroy Syria's chemical weapons. So that was at the beginning of 2014. Everybody was, you know, there's lots of meetings. How are we going to do this? And then Russia went in and illegally annexed Crimea. So it's for Russia to explain how it's not a threat to everybody else. And actually, you can ask our Finnish colleague here and Swedish colleagues why Finland and Sweden decided to join NATO of their own free will after Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine.
Okay, I think we had another question here. If you can identify yourself and your affiliation, please.
Yeah. I'm Marga. I study with these guys at Isada University.
Okay.
And my question to you guys is, that, like for me, tell me if you guys feel different, but it feels like when you're at the negotiation table with the US, you're not actually negotiating with the US, you're negotiating with Trump, with a difficult personality. And yeah, like how do you handle that? Is there a specific strategy that you guys use, or do you even feel like this is the case?
I was there during the first Trump administration. I left in 23, so I'm not there for the second one. It was, I think the way we did it at the time with Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg was first, every Secretary General needs to deal with all the allies. You know, and there are elections all the time in all, as there are now 32 allies, and the leadership changes and the political hue of that leadership changes. So you need to be able to deal and speak with everybody and try to achieve consensus with everybody. So you can't afford to pick and choose, you know, who your preferred ally or preferred partner is. But at the time, you may remember that even during the election campaign in 2016, Donald Trump was talking about how NATO was obsolete because the Europeans just weren't spending enough on defense, so you know, why should we care about that? And so the focus was less on the rhetoric, so we tried to cut through the rhetoric and to look at, you know, what was the main message. And the main message was actually an old message. And colleagues here have spoken about the fact that American leaders, even since Eisenhower, going on to President Kennedy, President Obama, so a lot of, you know, presidents that Europeans like, actually had the same message, in less brutal terms, of course, but the message was the same. And it's a message that actually makes sense. How can you explain to American taxpayers that America, the United States, cares more and invests more in the defense of Europe than Europeans themselves do? There's something wrong with that picture, right? So the message was an old message, so it meant cutting through the rhetoric and going to the message, and then saying, okay, he's right. How can we work on this message with all the allies? How can we create a platform for everybody to come to a consensus? Because, of course, no decision is taken in NATO without a consensus of all the allies. So there's no qualified majority voting like in the European Union. This is all consensus. And how do you make sure that that consensus is not at the minimum level? So, yeah, it's about cutting through the rhetoric, looking at the essence of the message, and then working together with everybody to find a way forward that makes NATO stronger and that responds to the national interests of everybody around the table.
Is it okay if we go to the next question so we have more time? Yeah. Sure. So he's next. Oh, okay, good. You first.
Hi. Thank you for your takeaways. My name is Paul. I come from the International Catalan Institute for Peace. And in this regard, I come with, it is my job to come with a bit of criticism to the rearmament doctrine that I'm sure that my Finnish and Swedish colleagues will disagree with. But basically, I would like to ask you, in this context of a stronger EU, stronger Europe, whether it is in partnership with the US or not, in this world where strength is respected and might makes right, what would it imply economically, first, for the European countries to allocate a lot of resources to defense and take them from somewhere else? And in terms of politically speaking, you said that this alliance now serves the purpose of defending against an actor that is led from the hubris of an authoritarian regime that is Russia. But what would it mean to align ourselves with the democratic backsliding that has suffered the United States, and that we have fanatics, religious fanatics and sexual abusers like Pete Hegseth at the head of the Department of War? How could we undergo this this alignment with this rearmament doctrine, without falling ourselves into this democratic backsliding, because the far right in Europe is the one that advocates the most for this. And in this regard, I would like to ask you, what do you think about the current Spanish administration's stance on this matter? So thank you.
Do you want to take that one? Do you want to?
Okay.
Take that one. I think part of what has made this discussion unhelpful is to link defense spending entirely to Trump. This is a real threat. It's a threat you don't feel as much here, and you feel it slightly more in the Netherlands, but you really feel it in the East. Right? I was at the Baltic Military Conference a week ago, and the discussions by the Lithuanians and the Latvians and Estonians and the Poles and so on is very, very different, and for good historical reasons. So this investment in security and defense, and that's why when I said Oana basically said something that I also like to say is like, we're not doing this just to spend money, right? And that's weird for someone who works in defense analysis. I think most of the time, if I would prefer to live in a world where I don't have to throw away, millions and millions of euros on air defense interceptors, well, you can just do so many other things with that. That said, there is an aggressive state on the east of Europe, and it's not for all the things that we can, maybe rightly criticize the West writ large and the US and specific European states for, that they could have done better to manage the relationship with the US or with Russia and so on. The fact is also something else, right? We had massive defense cuts after the end of the Cold War, to an extent that by the time Russia annexed Crimea, yes, there had been the enlargement of NATO, but most of European defense was actually in pretty crappy shape. It's sort of a very niche thing, but try to look up the readiness reports for the German armed forces in the mid-2010s, right, around the annexation of Crimea. There's like 10–20% of the tanks and planes and boats drive, float, and fly, right? It was really bad. No munitions, right? You have military exercises where soldiers are literally going bang, bang, because there's no more munitions, right? So at the same time, while NATO enlarged, it also disarmed itself, right? So, and now there's a real threat. And Russia has, in 2014, was it punished for annexing Crimea? Not really, right? Or not really not. And yet it persisted. Right? So what does that tell us? I think we've already run the experiment a few times now. We said, look, we prefer to spend our money on other things, take another avenue. And Russia has decided repeatedly not to do this. So that leaves it in a position where I think there's no alternatives except to rearm and to send a very clear message that will defend every inch of the alliance. And finally, I would caution not to transplant what might be specific Spanish debates onto the rest of Europe. The far right in the Netherlands, in Germany, in most of Western Europe, doesn't want to spend on defense at all. They're opposed to this. They're, on the whole, pretty sympathetic to Russia, right? So it's really the centrist parties, center-right to center-left, that advocate spending more on defense. I cannot have that, if I have this discussion with the more far-right in the Netherlands, I'm not going to go get anywhere, or in Germany and so on, right? So it's a bit, all of us in Europe, even though we talk about Europe as a collective, there's some very specific national dynamics you have to pay attention to. And I think maybe more so if you're in Spain or Portugal, you're sort of removed, you're also a bit removed from the Cold War history. And there's a lot of things that sort of historical legacies that sort of build on each other, we all have a bit of very specific historical paths on that.
Okay.
Could I just say also that this is not just about, fully agree, this is not just we're not doing this for Trump. To be clear, we're doing it for ourselves. And it's not just about NATO, it's also the European Union has established that as a priority, protecting a Europe that protects. So I think we really, it's quite an easy narrative to be against more investment in our own defense because it's somehow connected to Trump. And if you want to be a reliable partner in Europe, then if you want a stable Europe, because of course you also depend economically, socially on others in Europe, I think we need, all our countries collectively need to invest more in our own defense, because ultimately it's peace and stability that's the foundation for everything we have. There's no point in spending lots of money on hospitals and kindergartens if we don't have peace and security. You just need to look at Ukraine. So I think it's really important that we see peace and security as a foundation for everything, and we also realize that we can't get that for nothing. Even if you invest 2% of GDP on defense, you still have 98% to invest in everything else. Hopefully it's going to be a bit more than 2%, but I will revert back to what Mark Rutte was saying earlier, because he was specifically asked about Spain, and I think, you know, he's right to say that, you know, he totally welcomes the position of Prime Minister Sanchez to reach 2% of GDP on defense this year, which of course is a significant investment. Also welcoming the fact that Spanish armed forces are really involved in a whole range of missions and have always been there. And the Spanish military, I've seen them in action and are extremely professional, very, very brave men and women. But at the same time, I think this idea that you can reach the capability requirements set through the NATO defense plans by increasing just by 0.1% of GDP on defense, best of luck. I think that would be a miracle. We'll have to see at the end of the day how that happens. Good luck.
So it's a debate on butter against guns, right? So you had the next. Yeah. Oh, she's there. Okay, then you'll be the next.
Sí, molt ràpida, t'ho prometo. I'm Sonia Andol. I'm professor of international politics at Universitat de Barcelona. Thank you very much for your interventions today. So I was very concerned by the title of the session because it's a new era. So are we assuming that the current damage on the alliance is not just a small gap in between what we would call normality times, or is it like really a new area, so it will be non-reversible? What is your thought on that? And second, very fast questions. I think the three of you kind of agree that Europe needs to enlarge its capabilities, but you've also mentioned that those should be always focused on deterrence more than possible active military interventions. So I would like to ask, can you name any capabilities that would be more focused on security instead of military or defense that Europe should definitely put a lot of efforts and also like resources to increase? Thank you.
I will give you 2 minutes, Jonathan, maybe you're next, so we can take more questions.
Well, I will say that the title is interesting to me as well, because for those of you who have been following following Beijing's diplomatic offensive in the last several months, each meeting that they have with these foreign heads of state in Beijing, the statements that they release afterwards contain certain subtle references to Chinese political discourse, which of course is using this same phrase, the new era, right? Common prosperity for the new era is the Chinese discourse. That's how they construct it. So in terms of whether it's a problematic title or not, I don't really have a position on it, but maybe if we want to talk more about capabilities, you can.
Okay, now is your turn. Do you have the microphone?
You just want me to answer her question?
On deterrence.
On the okay.
Yeah, because
okay.
there were kind of two questions.
Okay.
Okay, the two questions, the first one, I don't think it's just a speed bump. I don't think that this, and we still have 3 years to go. It's really unclear. And the amount of capabilities that the administration has already used in the Persian Gulf also changes the context quite significantly, and that war is not over yet and may not be over anytime soon. So I would not count, I think it's a real mistake to just assume that this is going to be a bit of arguing back and forth and some tweets, and we all get upset and then everything is fine again. We did that the last time around and it wasn't fine afterwards. There's something substantially different happening. And in terms of the military capabilities, I don't think it's either or. And I also think you have to think specifically about what Russia is trying to do, which is, if deterrence works, it goes hybrid. If hybrid actions are properly resisted, then it attempts to sort of test the coherence of the alliance conventionally. And if those two things hold, then it sort of links it to the implicit or sometimes very explicit nuclear threats, right? So all three come together. And I think we have to think of Russia without sort of demonizing it, but we have to think of it as a very strategic actor. Not that they don't make plenty of mistakes, but the strategic actor whose strategic calculus or strategic culture is focused on probing for weaknesses. And if they perceive a weakness, they push harder. If they perceive little or no weakness, well, then at least they pause pushing on that point for a while and look for another weak point. But those three sort of roughly, and they overlap with each other, but sort of hybrid, conventional, and nuclear are not dissociated from each other and should not be treated as sort of silos apart from each other.
Okay. Quickly say that deterrence costs money, but deterrence will always be cheaper than defense.
Yep.
And I think that's important to know. Also, if you look at the 5% of GDP of defense, I know this is very contested, but look at the 1.5%, which is on defense-related capabilities, so not just on core defense issues, which I think are very relevant for countries like Spain, because that's about resilience, the resilience of your infrastructure. It doesn't have to be Russian tanks, triggering a major power cut in Spain. You still need to invest in the resilience of your infrastructure, of your cyber networks, your cyber defense, and all the things that help you resist an outside shock. And it could be floods in Valencia. So it could be lots of other things or threats from North Africa and the wider Middle East.
Thank you. Now it's your turn.
Okay, thank you. I'm Josep Ibáñez from Pompeu Fabra University. I teach international relations. And, well, thank you for all your insights. Very interesting, all of them. Let me add something or ask you something with an optimistic tone. The whole discussion somehow assumes a strategic view or a strategic perspective on the future. When we talk about partnership, deterrence, alliance, we are dealing with strategic instruments, strategic realities. And it seems to me that a big deal of the problem in the relationship between the US current administration and Europe has to do with a dysfunction in this strategic side or this strategic perspective on things. I think Europeans need to maintain this strategic perspective and the whole discussion and everything. I think it has the right tone. And my optimistic question would be, do you think that with another US administration more aligned with the strategic side, things could improve? And it doesn't mean that we will not discuss and negotiate, maybe not agree on certain issues, but we've gone beyond disagreements. I mean, when you treat your friends as cowards, insult them, that's something which goes beyond the diplomatic realm. And well, yeah, do you think things can improve?
Who takes out the crystal ball?
The American first.
Sure. Your comment reminds me of the French historian Fernand Braudel, who wrote a famous book about the Mediterranean. And in this book, he talks about historical change, but not short-term triggers, but very longue durée. And he uses the metaphor of the Mediterranean, saying that although we might perceive from the surface of the water these slight variations and waves and so on, what's really moving the Mediterranean is the current that's underneath, right? So I think it's a good sort of instructive metaphor for thinking about where these things come from. And what I mean to be much clearer is we have to be careful not to reduce the instability and the changes that are happening right now to Trump's personality and Trump's sometimes incoherent strategy, because there are real long-term strategic changes that are happening, especially in industrialization and political economy around the world that are below the surface. Yeah, that's what I would say.
Yeah, and again, I would emphasize that you could see not the rhetoric, but you could see some of these shifts clearly during the Biden administration. Biden being sort of the sort of most pro-Atlantic, most sort of huggable U.S. president we've had in decades and will likely have, and you still saw this. So if we had a Harris administration right now, the rhetoric would be friendlier, but the substantial structural shifts would still be taking place in different ways. So I don't think you should, I mean, repeating myself, but don't ignore that at all. Now, in terms of, which I think the first part of your question was about sort of European, that we shouldn't fall into the rhetoric of threat and deterrence and all these things. I think that I'm, as my academic self, I'm willing to go along with that, but only to a certain point, right? In the end, if you don't have industrial resilience and you don't have armed forces prepared and you don't adapt to the changing character of warfare, well, you know, you can ask the Ukrainians how much it matters, right? There is a, without going into the IR realism über alles kind of debate, which I'm not, but you're still a hard objective reality that you have to deal with. And if you fail to deal with it, then you suffer the consequences.
In 1 minute.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. I think this is not about changes in weather, it's about climate change, you know, geostrategically. And as I said, we have no regret strategy for Europeans to become stronger for their own defense means that we will be stronger whatever that this climate change brings. We will be stronger partners for the United States, and we will also be able to speak in a different tone to the United States if needed. But also, if something catastrophic happens, we will be stronger as the continent of Europe, because I don't just mean the EU here. I don't think that the EU on its own could defend Europe. We need everybody together. So yeah, I think we have no other option but to invest more in our defense and also in our, you know, in our psychological defense, if you wish. It's also a strategic approach of understanding what's going on.
Okay, I have bad and good news. Bad news, time is over. Good news is we have a coffee break, so if you still have some questions, I think they will be a pleasure to answer to your questions. Thank you so much.
Okay.
Yeah.